It's called REAL for a reason. Resilient environments and landscapes. How can we improve the resilience of our built environments so that people and property are safer? Flood risk is real. Threats to life and property are real. Climate change is real. And it's here. And it's now.
We don't want to build in a place that's going to be underwater in 20, 30, 50 years.
Welcome to Watershed Matters, a podcast by the Watershed Institute. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about how key environmental regulations in New Jersey are shaping the state's future with regards to climate change. We are joined today by a very special guest, former New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection Commissioner Shawn LaTourette. Shawn, in his tenure as DEP Commissioner, oversaw the passing of some very key policies, including the New Jersey Environmental Justice Law in 2023, and most recently, the REAL Rule passed just this past January. And now I'll pass it over to Executive Director Jim Waltman.
So we're really excited today to have a very special guest. As Lucia mentioned, we have the very recent turned former Commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, Shawn LaTourette. A little bit of background. Shawn was commissioner there from 2021 through 2026, so a good long run. Started at DEP as chief counsel in 2018 and has a long and distinguished legal career before that, working in environmental law and other legal practices. He was partner and director of environmental law department at the Law and Government Relations firm of Gibbons, PC. Before that, he was environmental lawyer, community advocate, and firm business manager at Lieberman and Blecker, PC. Shawn, you're a graduate of Rutgers University, I believe, and Rutgers Law School as well. So thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Appreciate the Rutgers plug.
There you go.
And more importantly, all that you do here at the Watershed.
You bet. New Jersey guy. So I think I have this right. It's just been about 2 months since you left a very intense job, and we're going to talk about all the accomplishments and some of the controversies. But what have you been doing for the last 2 months?
Sleeping. Something I did very little of over the last 8 years.
Yeah, I bet.
So making sure that I am resting up for the next adventure. And I also teach at Rutgers Law. So right now I'm teaching climate change law and policy at Rutgers Law in Camden, which is my alma mater where I went. So
Excellent.
happy to be there. And we're smack in the middle of the spring semester. And yeah, 2 months since leaving DEP. In a way, it feels like a blink, but I've been sleeping a lot better.
I bet. Well, there were so many big issues that you faced. Certainly climate, that probably the biggest one, the one that the Watershed Institute believes is the biggest threat to our water resources, the core mission of the organization. And it's happened in a context where the federal government's kind of stepped back at best from the responsibilities that it clearly has in this area. The timing is interesting. Right now, our EPA just reversed what was 25 plus years of environmental policy, the so-called endangerment finding, the basis for most of the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. We try not to get too far in the weeds here, but it's a tough time with the federal government not playing the role that many of us expect it to. So talk a little bit about that. What is the burden on a state like New Jersey, and how did you move forward in that context?
It's a really interesting question and an important one. Interestingly enough, the Environmental Law Institute, which is a national organization that uplifts environmental legal issues and brings environmental lawyers together, there was a convening this fall, the Environmental Law Institute, asking this very same question about the state of cooperative federalism, right? Which, not to get in the weeds of a complicated legal principle, it basically means partnership between the state and the federal government. The federal government does a certain number of things with respect to keeping our air and water clean, and the state does the rest. The state governments in this country implement 90% of the federal environmental laws. So when you see the federal government backing away from some of the key pillars of the Clean Air Act relative to the endangerment finding, that doesn't mean the state governments are off the hook for implementing that 90% of environmental law. That work continues. And it's more important than ever to have a focus at your state and your local level in order to ensure that the resources that we all rely upon, right, our water, the health of our watersheds, chief among them, right, it's more important than ever that we discharge those responsibilities. And so happy to talk more about that today.
That's great. Yeah. Well, we've talked on the first few episodes of this podcast about the impact that climate change is having on our water. The manifestations include flooding and droughts and real problems with water pollution. Things that 5-10 years ago we didn't talk a lot about, the harmful algal blooms that are out just exploding across New Jersey, Northeast, and the entire world, really. And what do we do with these? What do we do about these? So early in Governor Murphy's tenure, he put out an executive order and basically pointed his finger at DEP and said, hey, what are you going to do, right? How are you going to change the regulatory framework in the department to recognize the reality of climate change and then do something about it? So maybe talk about that, the so-called NJ PACT, what that was all about, and how you set out to try to do something to protect the state.
Sure. So at the outset, I think it's important to recognize what an executive order is and what it does or what it doesn't do, right? Executive orders don't create new law. Executive orders, when issued by a governor or a president, they instruct the apparatus of government, in this instance, state government, about how to perform and prioritize the work that any government agency does. And so when Governor Murphy issued executive orders directing the Department of Environmental Protection to integrate climate change considerations into our existing environmental regulatory scheme, that's, well, easier said than done, number one. And number two, and perhaps surprising to some, is something that we've always done as a state government. New Jersey has been a leading force, right, across administrations, across political parties in advancing environmental and climate protections, right? Governor Kane actually signed the very first executive order in this state that regards climate change, right? And I think it's important to hearken back to the nonpartisan nature of this important work and how it has cut across political administrations, and its foundations have long existed in our laws, no more so than in the Flood Hazard Area Control Act in New Jersey. And I'll try not to go too lawyer on everybody.
Let's dig in there and just talk about the flooding that we've seen in the state, and then what does DEP do to try to protect the residents of the state from that problem?
Sure. So in New Jersey, since the 60s, we've had the Flood Hazard Area Control Act. And the Flood Hazard Area Control Act it's a public safety and property protection law more than anything else. Right? The state government says, look, we must perform on a statewide basis the work of managing our floodplains. And in many places around this country, that's done in a patchwork framework across local governments. And here in New Jersey, we have a unified statewide approach to floodplain management that's administered by the Department of Environmental Protection. And effectively, the DEP sets standards for the safety of structures that are proposed to be constructed in a floodplain. And those standards are based on historical data. The standards that are set for flood protection, both for the identification of where the flooding may go, right, how a floodplain changes over time, and the standards for how we either harden or elevate our buildings and infrastructure, that is based on information collected over 100 years looking backward. And there's a very hard question that we had to ask ourselves about whether the data, the information upon which these regulations are based, are current, number one. And then number two, do they accurately anticipate the changing nature of our landscapes due to the fact that we are seeing and can expect more extreme precipitation, more storm surge, higher sea levels? And the answer to those questions is, well, number one, no, they're not current. Right? The information is too outdated. And number two, it doesn't account for existing circumstances. Certainly, that data doesn't account for looking forward, right? And why is it important to look forward? Well, we're planning every day to make investments, right? Spend our livelihoods on a new home, right? Build out a community to ensure our economic growth and success, right? That we all thrive together. And we're making those plans. We're investing significant sums, and we're not accounting for the changing nature of that landscape.
So we don't want to build in a place that's going to be underwater in 20, 30, 50 years. And we don't want to build in a way that's going to put people downstream from us underwater, simply stated. And that's what you were trying to get at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's an important caveat I would add to that, which is we build in floodplains all the time. It depends on the type of building and how that development is secure so that in the event of the storm, people are safe, right? If we think back to just a few years ago, 2021, the year I became commissioner, the state experienced tropical storm Ida.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't a hurricane by the time it hit New Jersey. It was really just a tropical depression, basically a really bad thunderstorm. 30 people lost their lives, right? Folks flooded out of first floor living spaces in riverine communities. And I think that was a benchmark event for New Jersey in its interior communities, meaning our inland communities around rivers and streams. Much like Superstorm Sandy was a benchmark event for us on the shore.
Lucia spends a lot of time in Manville, which is one of those towns that was just hammered. And
Yeah. One of my first couple weeks actually in this role, I attended with my manager, Mike Pissarro, a hearing in Manville of residents testifying in front of FEMA about just how they have been affected by Hurricane Ida. And it was very intense. People are living out of vans, living out of their cars. A lot of those people still are not in their homes to this day. Lots of new homeowners, people with kids, new homeowners that weren't aware of the risks and weren't aware even that their home was in a flood area. So I guess that leads up to a particular question that I had. How can we, DEP certainly is at the forefront of this, but even like the Watershed Institute as well, like we have been trying and we are making real ground in progressing in awareness of flooding issues and what are flooding hotspots. But what do you see as some ways that we can move forward with our outreach and our communication so that we are preventing, we can't completely prevent a situation like that from happening again because climate change is climate change, but just some steps, I guess, to mitigate those kinds of situations.
First of all, I want to compliment you for going to that hearing because I think that is a big part of the work. I think it's really important to be present in community. And when I was at DEP, much like in my career as a lawyer, being with people in the places where they live, work, learn, and recreate, and understanding what their lived experience of their environment, right, both natural and built environments I think is critical to be able to build the pathways for communicating what is important. So I applaud you for that because those stories are hard to hear, and you can see the need for sound policy in those settings. I think that in terms of making sure that we're communicating and doing so concertedly, think it takes organizations like this one to um, distill for people what information is developed at the government level, at the in our academic institutions, and to help them see themselves in it, right? Because it can feel really abstract, right? We're talking about climate change and flooding patterns writ large. Folks can not have that information can feel a bit abstract, and folks not see themselves in it.
Detached.
Yes.
Yeah.
From reality.
Yeah.
Folks can be detached from that, and then surprised and caught off guard and harmed when the adverse event happens. And kind of hearkening back to what Jim was asking earlier about the DEP back in 2020, being handed this directive from then Governor Murphy, to do the work of integrating climate change into regulatory schemes. That started with developing sound science, right? Both aggregating the global scientific information, supplementing that with state-specific climate information about what we experience now in New Jersey and what we can expect moving forward. And that resulted in the New Jersey specific report on climate change, what DEP calls the Climate Science Report, that was updated in 2020 at the end of 2025. And distilling that information and bringing that into the communities where you are, I think, is incredibly important. There's a lot of tools out there that analyze flood risk, right, that can inform folks. Bringing that into the community outreach that you do, I think, is incredibly important, because information is power. But folks don't have the time or the bandwidth, or they're balancing multiple jobs to be able to tear through 200 pages of climate science.
No, so that storm, really still haunts, I think, a lot of us. And I was maybe 3 weeks after the storm ripped through this area, walking the streets of Manville with the mayor, Richard Underko. And I mean, it was heart-wrenching. There was a guy, Shawn, that was sleeping in his car. His house had, the big orange X on it, which meant not safe to habitate.
Yeah.
He had been moved out of his house after the storm Irene from about 2011, 2012. So this had happened to this poor guy twice, right? Now, the question I asked after thinking about it a little bit, what systems told him that it was safe to start renting that second home that was also in the floodplain, also flood prone, right? So, and the mayor of Manville is a stormwater warrior who, he was actually trying to convince people to sell out to the Blue Acres program. We took that a little bit, but he was saying, well, every time someone takes me up on that, the town loses the tax base. But he's trying to save lives of people that are his residents, right? I think that's heroic work on his part. But there are places that just seem like they're not going to be appropriate to live in for very much longer. And what do we do about that? The science is predicting the storms are getting bigger, floodplains are getting wider, the seas are coming higher, right? So we can regulate to try to protect people against building in places that we think are very vulnerable, extra vulnerable. But all the houses that have been built and that are being lived in today that are in vulnerable places, what do we do with those?
And we are running out of undeveloped land too. New Jersey, we're not a big state. We have so many people. We're all elbowing each other for that extra space, that little remaining space.
Yeah. So, these are the
It's an easy one, right? Yeah.
Big
yeah,
weighty,
yeah.
big weighty
Diving right
questions.
Yeah.
And I think the work starts in looking at the problem honestly, right? And number one, not expecting the past to be an indicator of the present, or certainly not the future, because our incidence of flooding is very well documented as getting worse, right? Manville is in an inland community, right? So the flooding there is coming off of multiple tributaries to the river system, ultimately all feeding into the Raritan there, right? So being cognizant of where those risks are, having in place what we didn't at that time but do now, which is flood disclosure laws in the state of New Jersey. That wasn't in place at the time. And that is
So talk
now,
about it a little bit. What does that require?
So there is now in New Jersey a flood disclosure law, similar to many states around the country, and sort of surprising that we didn't have one, meaning when you are selling your home, right, or any property, right, anybody who's bought or sold property knows the realtor, the lawyers, they hand you these long forms to fill out, right? Has this ever happened? Has that ever happened? And you're providing information about your experience of that property to the would-be buyer. And it was not a required disclosure on those forms to indicate whether there was past flooding or not. And that law now exists, and flood disclosure is required. And folks were reticent about this law in the state of New Jersey because, well, we are a flood-prone state, and folks are concerned that that acknowledging the problem is detrimental to economic development, is detrimental to property values. And well, first of all, none of that has been borne out to be true, right? New Jersey is a very sought after state. More people are moving to New Jersey than leaving New Jersey, right? This is shown in the numbers year after year. We're a very desirable place to be, right? Location, right? Many reasons that folks want to be here in New Jersey. So the idea that sharing accurate information will just scare people away, well, it doesn't, right? Folks have said this or shared this concern about the disclosure of contamination, right? We're a previously industrial state, right? And that has a legacy of pollution that we've had to reckon with and clean up. And having to investigate and disclose that pollution in years past, folks were very concerned about, like, oh, this is going to reduce my property values. That is not borne out to be true either, right? So what is true is that information is power. It's power to the would-be buyer. It's power to the owner of property to take actions that will help to reduce risk. It's certainly powerful for a community in its planning, right? Because we're talking about vulnerable places, right? When we do that, when we talk about climate vulnerability, folks may get in their heads this idea of, oh, well, we're going to have to leave vulnerable places, or we're going to have to retreat, right? In my view, there's nowhere to retreat to.
Well, that's a big problem, right?
And that means improving the resilience of our communities iteratively over time so that they are lasting, right? Building more securely in the inland communities is not going to detract from value. It adds to value, right?
So let's shift a little bit from the inland to the coastal. I guess the last day of the administration, I don't know if you were working right up until January 20th or were already off the desk by then, but DEP adopted this really important rule that we've been advocating for alongside the DEP for many years, the REAL rule. So this resilient environments and landscapes. Maybe talk a little bit about that. Incredibly controversial. But I'll tell you a little anecdote. I was on the boardwalk in Asbury Park at a press conference. I can't remember what year it was at this point, but it was July, August period. DEP had just announced the rule was coming out, so the environmental community was there to champion this thing. The very next weekend, my family and I went down to a beach rental in, I won't name the town, but it was in the southern part of the state. I had to look at the website to check out an issue in the town, and blinking red letters on the front page of the website of this town that we were adopting for our home for the next week: DEP radical climate overreach. Call your assemblyman now. So it was about the real world. So here I was just, championing this thing in a press conference, and I'm moving into this beach rental. As we're moving into the rental, there's a little note about, some people refer to it as nuisance flooding or sunny day flooding, but we had a full moon and a high tide, and there was this little gizmo we were supposed to lodge into our glass door in the back of this rental to protect the house from the flooding that was coming up. So this town knows this, and yet they were squawking about doing anything to acknowledge sea level rise and to adjust how we're building there. So I'll use the word hypocrisy, I'll use the word disconnection from reality, but talk about what that real rule does, and then, what does it not do? And then a little bit about the controversy, to the extent you're comfortable doing that. And you were...
No, I'd like to quickly add to that some criticism that I've been seeing. Of course, there's that element too, but a lot of places complaining that the real rules unfairly put the burden on the private homeowners, the private landowners. So I guess from that angle too, I guess if you could speak on what the real rules are and what they are not. I guess because really we're all sharing this burden of climate change. The homeowners are going to be experiencing the burdens of flooding with or without NJ PACT REAL. So if you could speak on that from that angle too, from what people are saying.
It's called REAL for a reason, right? Resilient environments and landscapes. How can we improve the resilience of our built environments so that people and property are safer, and the resilience of our natural environments that are too inundated by risks of flooding and other adverse impacts of our changing climate. And so that's why it's called REAL, right? Yeah. Because these circumstances are real, right? Flood risk is real. Threats to life and property are real. Climate change is real, and it's here, and it's now. And unfortunately, it only gets worse in the years ahead. And so how do we protect against that, right? And I don't say it gets worse in the years ahead to be hyperbolic. I'm not a hyperbolic sort, right? And folks talk about real being radical or chasing folks out of, developing communities. I think, oh my goodness. I mean, I'm a former redevelopment lawyer. I've helped people build things my entire career, right? So the idea that as a matter of governance that I would support something support a rule that would not enable the development of our communities is, it's sort of silly, nor does the law allow such a thing, right? There are some who would, in the advocacy community, who would say, look, we've got to get people out of vulnerable places. REAL has nothing to do with that. Whether someone wishes to relocate out of a vulnerable area is a personal choice, right? And the state government, we talked about a little bit about Blue Acres, is there to help you with that, right? But no rule that DEP has put forward during my tenure has existed to tell people all the things they can't do and all the places they can't build. No, not at all. Rather, it's the regulatory environment needs to be modernized so that our investments that we are making, right, will stand the test of time amidst a changing climate. And to do that, we have to honestly appraise the issue, right? The existence of that sunny day flooding is one issue, but how does a rising sea level affect that? And when we examine deeply the science, work with panels of international experts, some that we're lucky to have right here in New Jersey at Rutgers, Thank you, Bob Kopp and your team. When we appraise that issue honestly, we see the facts laid bare that New Jersey is at a greater risk of sea level rise, 2 times greater than the global average. Right? That does not mean that we must abandon our coasts or stop development of our barrier islands. Absolutely not. What it means is that from the perspective of a property owner, a developer of new property, of new structure, what it means is this is an important signal to take into account in the design of your new buildings, right? And what REAL does is say, look, that sea level rise is projected to be upwards of 4 feet within the next 70 years. And most structures that we build, we want to last that long. I live in a 100-year-old house. We are sitting here today in a structure that's how old?
More than 200 years. Yeah.
So we want our properties to last. We have an expectation that they will. And what REAL does is say, let's, as a function of that rising sea level, and there's a 17% chance that 4 feet is worse, right? It's not the most protective standard. It's not the most conservative standard, which most environmental and public safety laws are based on. It's a middle of the road approach that says, let's add 4 feet to the base flood elevation so that we are anticipating that changing changing sea level. And in many ways, communities that get across, up and down the coast are already doing this.
That's the other part of that, my little anecdote, right? So that we were renting, frankly, the cheapest house we could find on that particular barrier island. But the new structures that were going in looked like they were being built 15 feet up over the water line, right? So people aren't stupid, right? So if you're going to invest millions of dollars into a new home down the Jersey Shore, you don't want it to be wiped away with the next flood. So literally that's happening all around our old-ish house, even as the politicians from that town are saying, oh, this is a terrible thing. Don't make us do it, right?
Yeah,
Don't protect us from ourselves.
And we can
even
talk
though it's
about the
happening.
politicians
So,
in a moment, right?
Yeah.
And the sort of the small p political reaction
Yes.
to this, but I think the reality of the individual person is far more important, right?
Right.
What do people expect? People expect that their government is ensuring their safety, right? That when we turn on the tap, the water is clean, that when the floods come, we will be safe. And what happens when folks find out maybe the water isn't as safe as it should be, or that flood happens and they weren't safe, right? What then?
They yell at government.
What-
Right. Why did you let me
Their
build this?
trust in government is
Exactly.
eroded.
Right.
And we, not me anymore,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
those in government, right?
Right.
They owe folks,
Yeah.
right? That level of safety and service. And so all REAL does in so many ways is adjusts the baseline standard for new development, right? Not existing development, only new development, or substantially reconstructed buildings, to ensure that we're in a way codifying the current practice. Because if you are going down the shore and you are seeing a new home being built, you are noticing, right, that they're putting parking on the ground level, and that first livable floor is higher. And that's what we're talking about here in these rules, is the first livable floor. Why? Well, people shouldn't get flooded out of their first floor, right? That should be a safe place. And that's what these rules do.
So let's flip. There's another thing the rules do that's really important policy as well. And that's to attack what we've referred to in the past as the redevelopment loophole, right? So the stormwater rules in the state, and we've been leaders in the nation for a long time, require builders of new developments to do certain things to mitigate, to try to control the stormwater runoff so we're not harming people downstream. But in the past, if you took an old development that was built before any regulation, tore down the building and put something up new, as long as you didn't add new impervious cover, there was no stormwater requirement for the most part. And the real rule addresses that by requiring not the full array of stormwater mitigation that's required for a brand new development, but there's measures to mitigate that stormwater runoff in the real world. And that's really important policy, and we're excited about that. No less controversial. Right?
It is an important change. Now to be clear, it's in the redevelopment exception that exists today. Or I'm sorry, it's the rule is law.
Yeah.
So previously, in a redevelopment context, a property that was already impervious surface did not have to add. They had to deal with water quantity.
Correct.
They had to address the amount of runoff coming from the parcel if it's over an acre, right? If it's a large development, but they didn't have to address water quality, right? And so what the redevelopment, the closing of the loophole, it entitles effectively urban and highly developed suburban communities to get the same level of water quality treatment as everyone else. It just evens the playing field. Yeah. And we're not talking about some dramatic cost increase associated with these things, right? We're talking about holding back stormwater and removing the oils and the solids from it before it's ultimately released and affects the waterway or your neighbor, right? And a new development on a green field, right, has to do this. And by closing that loophole, we're improving over time.
Well, there's an opportunity,
water quality,
right? Yeah, exactly.
in communities that
New
have
normal.
degraded water quality.
Right.
And none of this is some gargantuan expense. And to the extent that there's frustration with it, I think that frustration, and it's an understandable one, is the frustration that comes with just changing the way we ordinarily do things, right? And look, I spent the last 8 years in government, and I can tell you that when you ask government to do something new and different, that can be hard. And you hear complaints about bureaucracy, right? And bureaucracy not wanting, being reluctant to change.
Yeah.
Bureaucracy is not the only instrumentality that is reluctant to change.
Yeah.
Right. And so you see this pushback because I guess it's just human to push back against change.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think it's a matter of ill will or anything like that. But it's also, while an important policy change, this is not, it's not an earth-shattering,
It's consistent with the general expectations that we all have for clean water and protection against flooding and all these things, but it's
and why shouldn't everyone have that same protection?
I do think what's also challenging for people too, there's this element, I learned it a while back, maybe you know the term, this concept of slow violence. The fact that climate change is an active slow violence that is happening over decades. It's not this, I mean, we obviously have storms like Tropical Storm Ida that are these big blips of drama that people notice, but overall it's just this buildup that's been happening over time. And so then over time, the new normal becomes less normal. And so really what we're doing here with the real rules, we're acknowledging this new normal that is not in fact a really normal. And I think people are having trouble processing that and just just also this whole entire concept that climate change has been happening at this very gradual but increasing pace over time. And it's just maybe you didn't notice the effect of climate change over the past year or even the past past years if you're just an average person trying to live your life. But if you look back over 50 years, you really see those changes.
Yeah. I think, that's a really important point, that there is this slow incremental change that maybe every day you don't notice you're not experiencing. And well, of course, yes, the water comes into the summer home and you need to guard against that, right?
Tuesday.
And then when government, in this case, DEP, which, not everybody always experiences government as their friend, says, let's adapt this rule so that we're building better, because here's what's going to happen, or what is very reasonably likely to happen with a high degree of confidence. Folks can react to that like, oh my goodness, that feels like such a big change, right? And it can be hard, I think, for an individual to think of their experience of their community to look and feel different than it does today, right?
Thanks again for joining us on Watershed Matters, the podcast of the Watershed Institute. In our conversation with former DEP Commissioner Shawn LaTourette, Lucia and I spoke to him quite a bit about the New Jersey Real Rule, and I wanted to give a little bit more color on that. First, we talked a lot about the protections of our environment and protecting people from flooding, the risk from climate change. But this is also an affordability issue, and it's a long-term financial and economic issue. In fact, Moody's Investor Services, so these are the folks that look at the ratings of the bond ratings for the state of New Jersey. They have said that New Jersey is at the forefront of addressing the risks from climate change. So again, very much a financial issue. Now, unfortunately, there has been swirling controversy around the Real Rule. A litigation has been filed by the New Jersey Business and Industry Association, as well as the New Jersey Builders Association, a separate lawsuit from several counties in the state, all trying to block the Real Rule. And there's also pending legislation in our state house. So the Senate President, Senator Scutari, introduced a Senate Concurrent Resolution 106 to try to block the Real Rule. Also in the Assembly, Assemblyman McClellan has introduced Assembly Concurrent Resolution 150, also to block the Real Rule. So here's where we need your help. If you go on our website, thewatershed.org, there is a blurb right on the homepage. Click on that. It'll tell you how you can help defend the Real Rule by sending a message to our governor and how to interact also with your elected representatives in our state legislature. They need to hear from you that the Real Rule is an important protector of New Jersey and our future against the pending climate change. And they need to hear from you that you oppose the legislative effort and the litigation to try to block the Real Rule. Let's pivot to another really important issue that you were a real leader on, Shawn, and are to be commended for that. But we're talking about the expectations. Sadly, one of the expectations we've had in this state and many others for a long period of time was urban areas where people with less financial capacity should be an expectation. There's going to be more pollution there. The water's not going to be as good. The air's not going to be as good. That's become an expectation of society. New Jersey did something that was considered radical by many, which was to attack this injustice, this environmental injustice, with legislation strongly enforced. That too has been really controversial. But let's talk a little about the environmental justice law in New Jersey and kind of the early few years of that implementation. And it's been a little bumpy. It's been celebrated in the environmental community, but not completely embraced, obviously, by others who have had as part of their business planning, their expectations, it's okay to put some of these things that other communities will not accept within their borders, but it's okay to put them in some of these other towns. Talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, so the issues of environmental justice are near and dear to my heart. I teach environmental justice at the law school. What the New Jersey legislature advanced in 2020, led by Senator Troy Singleton from Burlington County, and then Assemblyman, now Senator John McKeon from Essex, is to acknowledge this reality of our modern environmental, legal, and regulatory scheme. The advent of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, solid waste laws, etc. Those laws have broadly improved environmental quality and public health indicators for people across this country, right? And those laws grew up at a time when the rivers were catching on fire, right? And airsheds were stricken orange from pollution. And we improved those conditions and through these mainstay environmental laws, and we should be really proud of that. But that improvement was not experienced equally among all communities. There are places here in New Jersey and all across this country, and in fact the world, where people suffer a higher degree of the externalities, right? The pollution that we all together create, right? We're creating pollution right now. You're creating pollution right now watching this video, right? And because that is the nature of modern society. Pollution is created by generating energy, by our conveniences of the modern era. How we deal with that pollution, how we manage those environmental externalities is what determines health outcomes, what determines quality of life in communities. And there are places where pollution levels are higher, where waste is not as well managed as it should be, where air quality is more degraded, where water is not as clean, where waterways are not fishable or swimmable. And that is because of gaps in those laws that grew up in the 1970s and the 1980s. And what Senator Singleton, now Senator McKeon, had acknowledged through legislation, and I'm very proud to have helped them with this, is to try to fill those gaps and acknowledge the baseline conditions in some communities that require a little more than just the baseline pollution controls, so as to improve upon the conditions in already overburdened communities. And that's a big deal, right? It's the biggest change to environmental law in a generation, right? We did it here in New Jersey first. New York followed suit. They're not implementing theirs yet. And states around the country are looking to that as a model. We should be really proud of that. Implementation of it is a long game, right? But acknowledging those gaps and that we need to do better by our neighbors, I think is really important and something we should all be proud of as New Jerseyans.
Yeah. A challenge. So there is this communication issue that I've noticed just while out and about interacting with different municipalities, different stakeholders. Well, first of all, I would just also like to mention that in relation to flood hazard areas and the new flooding rules that have been coming out, environmental justice communities are, of course, extremely disproportionately in these flood hazard areas, including a town like Manville. And so something that the environmental justice law did was actually identify the areas where there are overburdened communities. Now, something I noticed in some towns was they were very resistant to this term overburden. They're like, we are not an overburdened community. If I am not a large city, if I am not a large urban metropolitan area, I am not how can I be overburdened? So with this term that the environmental justice law really, I think, brought to the forefront in New Jersey, what does it actually mean to have an overburdened community, and what do municipalities need to do if they are found to have an overburdened community under the environmental justice law?
So it's a good question. So a municipality doesn't have to do anything, right? So the law starts by identifying what are communities of concern that could be subject to higher levels of pollution, or that have the demographic indicators of being subject to higher levels of pollution in the past. And it uses that as a screening tool to say, here's a starting place where the community could be subject to higher levels of pollution. But in order to determine that, you have to whether an overburdened circumstance exists, you have to have a comparative analysis, right? So you're looking at one community block group, which is actually not an entire town, right? It's one of the second to smallest level of analysis under the census, a community block group. So you're looking at that block group as compared to the county, right, or the state as a whole, so as to examine how much pollution one community is subject to versus the county or the state. And through that comparative analysis, you can determine whether a community is adversely stressed by any one of these 26 indicators, right, relative to air quality or water quality. Right? The rules that implement the law identify 26 different stressors that are examined, and then from that point, again, has nothing to do with the municipality. But if a facility, a proposed new power plant, or a proposed new garbage transfer station, or a proposed new major source of air pollution wanted to locate in that adversely stressed community, it has to do advanced outreach to the community. Let people know what you're going to do before you do it, right? Engage who will be your neighbors and analyze that disproportionality. And if there is a disproportionate impact, you got to propose a pollution control to not make things worse, right? Is the main idea behind that law. And it doesn't apply to everything, right? It only applies to the most highly polluting facilities. Doesn't apply when somebody's building a home in a floodplain or a store, a transit-oriented development, only to 8 highly polluting facilities. But I think, part of what happens when changes like these are presented, not unlike with REAL, folks, and you can't blame people for this, right? We're all on information overload. But folks aren't paying attention to the details, and then they're expecting the worst. And there are interests out there that would amplify the worst, so that as to spark a political reaction. And I think that's why you see some reluctance maybe on the part of municipalities.
Yeah, they have like some stereotypes, that there are some stereotypes that have just been lingering, and I think that's also part of it as well.
Yeah, the environmental justice communities, those are only in Elizabeth and Newark and Camden.
Right.
Yeah,
right?
it's like if I'm not in those areas, I'm not overburdened community. For our viewers now, I believe this is still an active tool. I think I literally was looking at it last week. New Jersey does have a public mapping tool where you can go and look on the map within your own town, like what areas are designated as overburdened. I believe it's called EJ Map. Just to put into perspective how specific this is, there are towns that are barely a mile long in New Jersey. And within that mile, you will have different designations of one area of town might be considered overburdened, or another part of town might be considered overburdened for 2 reasons or 2 categories, and the other part might be for another category. So like this mapping tool really shows how like detailed this analysis was, and it is publicly available, and you can look at it yourself as well. And also see what possible contaminants are near you so that you are aware and are informed of the risks that you're potentially living near.
Shawn, you've had quite a run. We haven't gotten into some of the other things, enforcement against polluters, beginning regulation over the so-called forever chemicals, PFAS, but I want to kind of get a big picture sense from you after your time at DEP. Are you hopeful? Are you going home and curling up in a ball and throwing the covers over your head? You've seen a lot, right? Good and bad that the state has to offer. Its people are as interesting, perhaps I'll use that word, as any state's residents in the diversity and the geography and the backgrounds and the cultures here. So if you had to kind of sweep all of that up in your tenure at DEP, do you come out feeling hopeful? Do you depressed? What's the mood? What's the vibe, as they say?
So hopeful.
Good.
So hopeful. Look, I think it can be a little, how do I say this? I'm incredibly hopeful about New Jersey's environmental future, right? I'm hopeful about our ability to reduce and respond to climate change. I'm hopeful about our ability to grapple with the reality of synthetic contamination from synthetic chemicals like PFAS, forever chemicals. And I'm hopeful about that because of all the progress that was made, and not just in the last 8 years, 5 of which I spent as commissioner, which I'm really proud of personally and professionally, but because I'm hopeful because that is our way in New Jersey, right? We have in this state a long, strong, and bipartisan history of environmental protection, and that grows out of our industrial legacy, our experience with legacy pollution, right? We have some of the strongest environmental laws in the country, right? And those laws aren't a burden to progress. They're not. They don't exist to slow things down and to stop good things from happening, right? They exist to make sure that those expectations people have of clean water and clean air are met. And it requires us to be deliberative, not for us to be inactive, right, in an economic sense. But what gives me hope is that over the last 8 years of my time being at DEP, we facilitated $6.7 billion of investment in environmental infrastructure, in water infrastructure, clean drinking water, wastewater control infrastructure, flood control infrastructure, shore protection infrastructure. Right? We opened the first new state park in a generation, right, by acquiring 9 miles that will become the Greenway. We committed to the revitalization of Liberty State Park. In the last 8 years, we became the first state in the nation to achieve the 30 by 30 goal of preserving 30% of our land and water for conservation purposes. We have the most conserved open space as a matter of landmass of any state in the contiguous United States, right? Is there more work to do? Absolutely, right? We've only just begun to do our part to reduce the emission of climate pollutants, and more certainly needs to be done as we balance the need for energy and build new generation, right? All of which won't be necessarily carbon free because we've got to balance the needs of our population, right? But we can do that in a way that promotes public health and people's well-being, right? I think that our regulatory reforms to promote flood resilience will be lasting no matter what. Why? Because a couple of years ago, we enacted rules to increase elevations in the inland areas through the
Inland Flood Protection Act.
The Inland Flood Protection Rule.
Yep.
Not a single project has been denied, but they're safer,
Yes.
right? The same will occur on the coast. We'll get past the political nonsense and the misinformation we always do, right? Especially with organizations like the Watershed Institute sharing real facts with real people in the real world, right? So I'm hopeful, right? It's going to take something important, which is our resolve, right?
Well, this is also a state where the people will stand up and speak out to protect their values, protect their homes and their communities. And, Lucia and I are fortunate. We spend a lot of time, you more than I do these days, but the, hundreds, thousands of hours in the community, the township committee or the planning board meetings, when people feel like something's threatening their values or their communities, they don't let things happen. So the power of information, which I think you've really emphasized today, when people know what's at stake, they rally to the cause. We see that every week here, and we're just grateful for your partnership at DEP. That's been quite a bit, and looking forward to your future.
It's a great run.
So we'll break a little news here as well. Shawn, you've agreed to join the Board of Trustees of the Watershed Institute.
I sure did.
So we're really looking forward to having you on board. And I know you have a lot of people that want a piece of you. And I'm sure you're going to be involved in all kinds of committees and boards and have endless job prospects. So we'll look forward to seeing, unless you have other news to break, we'll see how that pans out for you in the weeks and months.
I have no news to break, but I do have points of gratitude for what you all do here, right? For the work that you do both, right, on this property, in this place, making it available for people, but the work you're doing in community, right, I think is incredibly important. I look forward to being a part of that, right? And I think it's so important that we, in this space of advancing environmental and public health improvements and protections, that we're not just fighting against things that could be negative, right? But that we're fighting for something, right? Because when you're fighting for something, you can bring people with you, right? And I think that's the story of this organization. I think it's the story of our state, right?
Absolutely.
Brought our bald eagle population back from the brink. We cleaned up Superfund site after site, right? We can build a more climate resilient New Jersey, right? We can improve our watersheds. We're doing that. You're doing that. So I thank you.
Well, thanks again for coming and joining us today.
Yeah,
and
thank you for being here, Shawn.
Yeah.
Thank you for the work you do on this podcast. It's so cool.